Just one last thing about this passage here in Matthew 22. Note how Jesus sums up the commandments. He says, all the commandments are summed up by this thing, by this one commandment. Does that mean he's doing away with the rest? No. But what Jesus is actually doing there is going back to his Hebrew heritage, his rabbinical teaching, if you will, because there's a thing they do where they sum up the whole of the laws. There's a famous Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, which says that God gave Moses 613 commandments. By the way, that's not in the Bible, that number. It's in the rabbinical commentaries. The Bible never gives you that number. There's 600. No, it's just what the rabbi said afterwards. David reduced them to 11 commandments. Then Isaiah the prophet to 6 commands. Then Micah the prophet, so we're going down the order of the prophets from so-called major to minor. Micah to 3, and then Habakkuk to 1. And the 1 is found in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. The just, the righteous, the person right with God, shall live by their faith. That's what Jesus is also doing here. He's going back to his rabbinical background and summing up the whole of the laws into the one. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, as you go through the Old Testament, and then we get to Jeremiah 31 and the whole thing about the new covenant, they knew, the rabbis, that there was a time coming where everything would be internalized, put in your heart. So at one point, you know the famous passage, I believe it's in Malachi, where God himself says, I'm sick of what you're doing because there's no heart in it. You don't have zeal for me anymore. They're doing it, right? But he faults them because it's about something else. The trajectory of the covenant and the law, the Torah as we call it, is there even in the Old Testament, where it's heading towards that what we now call new covenant age, the changing of laws. Even in the Old Testament, God is changing his laws, by the way. Deuteronomy, remember? God says to Moses, the sins of the fathers will come down on their children forever. Olam, forever. That's what God says in Deuteronomy. But then in Ezekiel, God himself changes it and says, I believe it's in Ezekiel 18, he says, no, it's no longer that way. Your sins, you'll be responsible for your individual sins. I'm not going to fault the child for the sins of their fathers or mothers. Isn't that interesting? So even there's this change of laws. So again, you go back to Matthew 5:17. Jesus never implied that he would just leave us Torah-less, lawless, because that's the criticism we get from especially the Sabbatarian people, right? That, well, you guys don't have any laws then. No, the simple fact is that we are under, like Paul, we are under the law of Christ and not the law of Moses. 1 Corinthians 9:20 is very clear. Also, when Jesus says these two laws sum up all the laws, right? Love the Lord your God. It's implied that if you love the Lord your God, you'll love his commandments. I think the simple meaning here is that if you love Jesus in this case, and God said listen to him, right, then you'll do what Jesus says. Not just in terms of loving one's neighbor, but Jesus said many other things. You know, he was here 40 days after his resurrection, after all.